Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 1. 4 Sisters. "Christmas won't be Christmas without any presents," grumbled Jo. She was lying on the rug. "It's so dreadful to be poor," sighed Meg, while looking at her old dress. "Some girls have plenty of pretty things, but the others have nothing at all," said little Amy. "We've got Father and Mother and each other," said Beth. The 4 young faces brightened at the cheerful words, but Jo said sadly, "We haven't got Father, and shall not have him for a long time." She didn't say perhaps never, but each silently added it, thinking of Father, far away at the war. Nobody spoke for a minute. Then Meg said, "You know, Mother says we must not spend money for presents this Christmas, because it's going to be a hard winter for everyone. Our men are fighting a war." "We've got $1 each, and that won't help the army. I don't want any presents from you or from Mother. Mother didn't say anything about our money, and she doesn't want us to give up everything. Let's each buy what we want. We work hard enough to earn it," cried Jo. "I know I do, teaching those tiresome children all day," complained Meg. "What about me?" said Jo. "It's not easy to be shut up for hours with a nervous old lady. She gives me orders all the time." "I think washing dishes and keeping things tidy is the worst work in the world," said Beth. "It makes me so tired that I cannot practice music." Beth sighed and looked at her rough hands. "You don't suffer as I do," cried Amy, "for you don't have to go to school with some cruel girls. They laugh at you if you don't know your lessons, they laugh at your dresses, and insult you." "I wish we had the money Father lost when we were little," said Meg. Jo immediately sat up, put her hands in her pockets, and began to whistle. "Don't, Jo, it's so boyish." "That's why I do it." "You must behave like a young lady," said Meg. "It didn't matter so much when you were a little girl, but now you are so tall, you should remember that you are a young lady." "I'm not," cried Jo. "I hate to think I've got to grow up and be Miss March. It's bad enough to be a girl, anyway, when I like boys' games and work and manners. I'm dying to go and fight with Papa, and I can only stay home and knit, like an old woman." Margaret was the eldest. She was 16, and she was very pretty, with large eyes, brown hair, a sweet mouth, and white hands. Jo was 15 years old. She was very tall, thin, and brown. Elizabeth, or Beth as everyone called her, was 13. She had bright eyes. She was a shy girl. She seemed to live in a happy world of her own. Amy was the youngest. She had blue eyes and yellow hair curling on her shoulders. It was 6 o'clock. Beth put a pair of slippers by the fire to warm. The sight of the old shoes had a good effect upon the girls, for Mother was coming, and everyone brightened to welcome her. Meg lighted the lamp. Amy got out of the easy chair without being asked, and Jo put the slippers nearer to the blaze. "They are old. Mother must have a new pair." "I thought I'd get her some with my $1," said Beth. "No, I shall," cried Amy. "I'm the oldest," began Meg, but Jo cut in with a decided voice. "I'm the man of the family now. Father is away, and I shall buy the slippers, for he told me to take special care of Mother." "I'll tell you what we'll do," said Beth. "Let's each get her something for Christmas, and not get anything for ourselves." "That's a good idea, dear! What will we get?" exclaimed Jo. Everyone thought for a minute. Then Meg announced, "I will give her a nice pair of gloves." "Army shoes!" cried Jo. "Some handkerchiefs," said Beth. "I'll get a little bottle of cologne. She likes it, and it won't cost much, added Amy. Let Mother think that we are getting things for ourselves and then surprise her. We must go shopping tomorrow afternoon, said Joe. Glad to find you so happy, my girls, said a cheery voice at the door. Mrs. March was not elegantly dressed, but she was a noble-looking woman. She got her wet things off, her warm slippers on. The girls flew about, trying to comfort their mother. Meg arranged the tea table. Joe brought wood and set chairs. Beth was quiet and busy, while Amy gave directions to everyone. As they gathered about the table, Mrs. March said, with a particularly happy face, I've got a letter from Father. A quick, bright smile went round like a streak of sunshine. A nice long letter. He is well, and thinks he will get through the cold season better than we feared. He sends his best wishes for Christmas, and a special message to you girls. Now come and, said Mrs. March. Give them all of my dear love and a kiss. Tell them I think of them by day, pray for them by night, and find my best comfort in their affection at all times. A year seems very long to wait before I see them, but remind them that while we wait, we may all work, so that these hard days need not be wasted. I know they will remember all I said to them, that they will be loving children to you, will do their duty faithfully, and that when I come back, I will be prouder than ever of my little women. Everybody sniffled when they came to that part. Joe wasn't ashamed of that great tear that dropped off the end of her nose, and Amy never minded the rumpling of her curls as she hid her face on her mother's shoulder and sobbed out, I am a selfish girl, but I'll truly try to be better. We all will, cried Meg. I think too much of my looks and hate to work, but won't any more, if I can help it. I'll try and be what he loves to call me, a little woman, and not be rough and wild, but do my duty here instead of wanting to be somewhere else, said Joe. Beth said nothing, but wiped away her tears with the blue army sock and began to knit with all her might, losing no time. Old Hannah cleared the table. The girls brought their little work baskets. The needles flew as the girls made sheets for Aunt March. Then at 9 o'clock they stopped work and sang as usual, before they went to bed. Beth played the old piano. Meg had a voice like a flute. She and her mother led the little choir. Amy chirped like a cricket, and Joe sang in the wrong place, but the girls never got too old to sing together. Chapter 2. A Merry Christmas. Joe was the first one to wake up on Christmas morning. Then the others woke up and went downstairs. Where is Mother? asked Meg. Goodness only knows, replied Hannah. A poor woman came to the door, and your mother went off to see what is needed. Hannah was with the family since Meg was born. She was more like a friend than a servant. She will be back soon, I think, so have everything ready, said Meg. She was looking at the basket full of presents for Mother. Where is Amy's bottle of cologne? She asked, as the little flask did not appear. She took it out a minute ago and went off with it to put a ribbon on it, I think, replied Joe. How nice my handkerchiefs look, don't they? Hannah washed and ironed them for me, and I marked them all myself, said Beth. There's Mother! Hide the basket, quick! Cried Joe, as the door slammed and steps sounded in the hall. But it was Amy. Where have you been, and what are you hiding behind you? Asked Meg. I went to change the little bottle of perfume for a big one, and I gave all my money to get it, and I'm truly trying not to be selfish anymore. Then there was another bang of the street door. They pushed the basket under the sofa and ran to the table for breakfast. Merry Christmas, Mother! They all cried. Oh, Merry Christmas, little daughters! I'm glad you began at once. But I want to say one word before we sit down. Not far away from here lies a poor woman with a little newborn baby. 6 children are in one bed to keep from freezing, for they have no fire. There is nothing to eat over there, and the oldest boy came to tell me they were suffering hunger and cold. My girls, will you give them your breakfast as a Christmas present? They were all unusually hungry, having waited nearly an hour, and for a minute no one spoke, only a minute, for Joe exclaimed impetuously, "I'm so glad you came before we began." "May I go and help carry the things to the poor little children?" asked Beth. "I shall take the cream and the muffins," added Amy. Meg was already piling the bread into one big plate. "I know you would do it," said Mrs. March, smiling. "You shall all go and help me, and when we come back, we will have bread and milk for breakfast." They were soon ready. A poor, bare, miserable room it was, with broken windows, no fire, a sick mother, a crying baby, and a group of hungry children with white, frightened faces. The poor woman smiled as the girls went in. "Ach, mein Gott! It is good angels came to us." Hannah, who had carried wood, made a fire. Mrs. March gave the mother tea and food, and she dressed the little baby. The girls put the children round the fire and fed them, laughing, talking, and trying to understand the funny, broken English. "Das ist gut, die Engelkinder," cried the poor things as they ate. The girls had never been called angel children before. It was a very happy breakfast, although the girls ate nothing. And when they went away, leaving comfort behind, nobody was happier than the 4 hungry little girls. "That's loving our neighbor better than ourselves, and I like it," said Meg, as they set out their presents while their mother was upstairs collecting clothes for the poor Hummels. "She's coming! Open the door, Amy!" cried Joe. Mrs. March was surprised and touched, and smiled with her eyes full as she examined her presents and read the little notes on them. The girls were really very busy for the rest of the day. That evening they were going to act a play that Joe had written. They were still too young to go often to the theater, and not rich enough to afford it. So they had memorized their words and had worked hard to make clothes for the characters in the play. On Christmas night, a dozen girls came to watch them. They sat before the blue and yellow curtains. Then a bell rang, the curtains were opened, and the play began. The visitors liked the play very much. After the play, Hannah appeared and asked, "Would the ladies walk down for supper?" This was a surprise even to the actors, and when they saw the table, they looked at one another in amazement. There was ice cream, cake, fruit, and French bonbons, and in the middle of the table, 4 great bouquets of flowers. They stared first at the table and then at the mother. "Is it fairies?" asked Amy. "Santa Claus," said Beth. "Mother did it," said Meg. "Aunt March sent the supper," cried Joe. "All wrong. Old Mr. Laurence sent it," replied Mrs. March. "The Laurence boy's grandfather? What in the world put such a thing into his head? We don't know him," exclaimed Meg. "Hannah told one of his servants about your breakfast party. That pleased him," said Mrs. March. "He knew my father years ago, and he sent me a polite note this afternoon, asking if he could send my children a few Christmas presents. I could not refuse." "It's that boy's idea. I know he did it," said Joe. "He looks as if he wants to know us, but he's shy, and Meg doesn't let me speak to him when we pass." "You mean the people who live in the big house next door, don't you?" asked one of the girls. "My mother knows old Mr. Laurence, but says he's very proud, and doesn't like to meet with his neighbors. He keeps his grandson shut up when he isn't riding or walking with his tutor, and makes him study very hard. We invited him to our party, but he didn't come. Mother says he's very nice, but he never speaks to girls. Our cat ran away once, and he brought her back, and we talked over the fence, and were getting on, all about cricket and so on, when he saw Meg coming and walked off. I want to know him because he needs fun. I'm sure he does, said Joe decidedly. He brought the flowers himself. I like his manners, and he looks like a little gentleman, so I have no objection to you knowing him, said Mrs. March. Chapter 3. The Laurence Boy. Look, cried Meg, an invitation from Mrs. Gardner for tomorrow night. Mrs. Gardner would be happy to see Miss Meg and Miss Josephine at a little dance on New Year's Eve. Mother says we should go, but what shall we wear? What's the use of asking that? You know, we shall never wear our cotton dresses, because we haven't got anything else, answered Joe. If I only had a silk, sighed Meg. Mother says I may when I'm 18, perhaps, but 2 years is too long to wait. I'm sure our dresses look like silk, and they are nice enough for us. Yours is as good as new, but I forgot the burn in the hole in mine. What shall I do? The burn shows badly, and I can't take any out. You must sit still and keep your back out of sight. The front is all right. I shall have a new ribbon for my hair, and my new slippers are lovely, and my gloves are all right. Mine are spoiled with lemonade, and I can't get any new ones, so I shall have to go without, said Joe, who never troubled herself much about dress. You must have gloves, or I won't go, cried Meg decidedly. Gloves are more important than anything else. You can't dance without them. I'll tell you how we can manage. Each of us will wear one good one and carry a bad one, said Joe. Your hands are bigger than mine, and you will stretch my glove dreadfully, said Meg. Then I'll go without. I don't care what people say, cried Joe, taking up her book. You may have it, you may, but just behave nicely. Don't put your hands behind you, or stare, will you? Don't worry about me. On New Year's Eve, the 2 younger girls helped the elder sisters to dress. There was a lot of running up and down, laughing and talking. Meg wanted a few curls around her face, and Joe tried to pinch her papered hair with a pair of hot tongs. Should they to smoke like that? Asked Beth. It's the wetness drying, replied Joe. What a bad smell! It's like burned feathers, said Amy. There, now I'll take off the papers and you'll see the little curls, said Joe, putting down the tongs. She did take off the papers, but no little curls appeared, for the burned hair came with the papers. Oh, what have you done? I can't go! My hair, cried Meg. You shouldn't have asked me to do it. I always spoil everything. I'm so sorry, but the tongs were too hot, and so I've made a mess, said Joe unhappily. Don't worry, said Amy. Tie your ribbon so the ends come on your forehead a bit, and it will look fashionable. I've seen many girls do it, said Amy. I wish I'd let my hair alone, cried Meg. So do I. It was so pretty. But it will soon grow out again, said Beth, coming to kiss and comfort her shorn sheep. At last Meg was ready. The 2 girls looked very well in their simple suits. Each put on one nice, light glove and carried the dirty one. Have a good time, dearies, said Mrs. March. Don't eat too much, and come home at 11 when I send Hannah for you. As the gate clashed behind them, a voice cried from a window, Girls! Girls! Have you both got nice pocket handkerchiefs? Yes, and Meg has cologne on hers, cried Joe. "Now don't forget to behave properly," said Meg. "I know I shall forget. If you see me doing anything wrong, just remind me by a wink, will you?" replied Joe. "No, winking isn't ladylike. I'll lift my eyebrows if anything is wrong, and nod if you are all right. Now hold your shoulders straight, and take short steps, and don't shake hands if you are introduced to anyone." "How do you learn all the proper ways? I never can." They felt timid, for they seldom went to parties. Mrs. Gardner greeted them kindly and handed them over to the eldest of her 6 daughters. Meg knew Sally and began to enjoy herself with Sally very soon, but Joe, who didn't care much about girls or girlish gossip, stood about, with her back carefully against the wall colt in a flower garden. Some boys were talking about skating in another part of the room, and she longed to go in and join them, for skating was one of the joys of her life. She looked at Meg, but the eyebrows went up so alarmingly that she could not move anywhere. No one came to talk to Joe. She could not roam about because of the hole in her dress, so she stared at people till the dancing began. Meg was asked to dance. The tight slippers hurt her feet, but still she kept on smiling. Then Joe saw a big red-haired boy coming toward her. She quickly went in a small room to be alone. Unfortunately, another shy person had chosen the same place to hide. She found herself face to face with the Laurence boy. "Dear me, I didn't know anyone was here," said Joe. But the boy laughed and said pleasantly, "Don't mind me. Stay if you like." "Won't I disturb you?" "Not a bit. I only came here because I don't know many people and felt rather strange at first, you know." "So did I. Don't go away, please." The boy sat down again quietly, till Joe said, trying to be polite, "I think I've seen you before. You live near us, don't you?" "Next door." And he looked up and laughed when he remembered how they had chatted about cricket when he brought the cat home. Joe laughed too and said, "We did have such a good time with your nice Christmas present." "Grandpa sent it." "But you gave him the idea, didn't you?" "How is your cat, Miss March?" asked the boy, trying to look cool while his black eyes shone with fun. "Fine, thank you, Mr. Laurence. But I am not Miss March. I'm only Joe," returned the young lady. "I'm not Mr. Laurence. I'm only Laurie," said the boy, and then asked, "Don't you like to dance, Miss Joe?" "I like it if there is plenty of room and everyone is lively. In a place like this, I'm sure to upset something, tread on people's toes, or do something dreadful." "Sometimes. You see, I've been abroad a lot, and I don't know how you do things here." "Abroad?" cried Joe. "Oh, tell me about it. Did you go to Paris?" "We spent last winter there." "Can you talk French?" "We were not allowed to speak anything else." "Are you going to college soon?" asked Joe, and added, "I think you're studying hard." Laurie smiled and answered, "Not for a year or 2. I will be 16 next month. I won't go before 17 anyway." "I wish I was going to college. You don't look as if you like it." "I hate it, and I don't like the way fellows do either, in this country." "What do you like?" "To live in Italy, and to enjoy myself in my own way." Joe wanted very much to ask what his own way was, but he looked very serious, so she changed the subject by saying, "That's a nice polka. Why don't you go and dance?" "If you will come too," he answered. "I can't. I told Meg I wouldn't because—" There Joe stopped and looked undecided whether to tell or to laugh. "Because what?" "You won't tell?" "Never." "Well, I have a bad habit standing before the fire, and so I burn my dresses, and I burned this one too." Although it's nicely mended, it shows, and Meg told me to keep still so no one would see it. You may laugh if you want. It is funny, I know." But Laurie didn't laugh. He only looked down a minute and said very gently, "Never mind. There's a long hall out there, and we can dance there so that no one will see us." Joe thanked him and gladly went with him. The hall was empty, and they had a grand polka. When the music stopped and they sat down, Joe saw Meg waving at her. She followed her into a side room, where she found her sister on a sofa, holding her foot and looking pale. "I've hurt my ankle. It aches so. I can hardly stand, and I don't know how I'm going to get home," she said. "I knew you'd hurt your feet with those silly shoes. I'm sorry, but I don't see what you can do, except get a carriage, or stay here all night," answered Joe, softly rubbing her ankle as she spoke. "A carriage costs too much. I'll rest till Hannah comes." "They are going out for supper now. I'll stay with you." "No, dear, go and bring me some coffee." Joe went to the dining room and found the coffee, but she spilled some coffee on her dress. She tried to clean it with Meg's glove. "Can I help you?" said a friendly voice. And there was Laurie, with a full cup in one hand and a plate of cake in the other. "I was trying to get something for Meg, who was very tired, and someone shook me, and here I am in a nice state," answered Joe. "I was looking for someone to give this to. May I take it to your sister?" "Oh, thank you. I'll show you where she is." Joe led the way. Laurie brought a second cup of coffee and cake for Joe. They had a happy time, talking, laughing. Then Hannah came. Meg forgot her foot and rose quickly, and she cried out with pain. Laurie offered his grandfather's carriage, which had just come for him. He sat with the driver so Meg could keep her foot up, and the girls talked about the party. "I had a nice time, did you?" asked Joe. "Yes, till I hurt myself. Sally's friend, Annie Muffet, asked me to come and spend a week with her when Sally does. She's going in the spring," answered Meg. They were home at last. They thanked Laurie and went into the house, hoping to wake no one. But as they opened the door, two sleepy voices cried out, "Tell us about the party! Tell us about the party!" Chapter 4. The Neighborhood. "Oh, how hard it seems to go to work," sighed Meg. "I wish it was Christmas all the time." When Mr. March lost his money to help a friend, the two eldest girls wanted to work to earn money. Margaret began teaching 4 small children of the King's family. As she said, she was fond of luxury. At the King's house they had everything that Meg liked. Joe went to Aunt March, who was alone and needed someone to help her. Aunt March was an old lady who always complained, but Joe did her best to make her happy. Beth was too shy to go to school, so her father taught her at home. She helped Hannah at homework, never thinking of any reward but to be loved. Beth had some problems as well as the others. She was sad because she couldn't take music lessons and have a fine piano. Amy was called Little Raphael by her sisters, for she had a great talent for drawing, and was never so happy as when drawing flowers or illustrating stories. The 2 older girls were a great deal to one another, but each took one of the younger sisters into her keeping and watched over her as a mother. One snowy afternoon, Joe went to the garden. The garden separated the March's house from that of Mr. Laurence. It seemed as a lonely house. A few servants, the old gentleman, and his grandson. "There he is," thought Joe. "Poor boy, all alone." As she threw a handful of soft snow, Laurie opened the window. How are you? Asked Joe. I've had a bad cold and been shut up a week. I'm so much bored. Have someone come and see you. There isn't anyone I'd like to see. Boys make such a row. Isn't there some nice girl who'd read and amuse you? Girls are quiet and like to play nurse. Don't know any. You know us, began Joe, then laughed and stopped. So I do. Will you come, please? Cried Laurie. I'm not quiet and nice, but I'll come. If Mother will let me, I'll go ask her. Soon after, Joe was at Laurie's house. Here I am, she said. Mother sent her love and was glad if I could do anything for you. Meg wanted me to bring some of her cake, which she makes very nicely, and Beth thought her cats would be comforting. I knew you'd laugh at them, but I couldn't refuse. She was so anxious to do something. How kind you are, said Laurie. Shall I read to you? Asked Joe, looking affectionately toward some inviting books nearby. Thank you. I've read all those, and if you don't mind, I'd rather talk, answered Laurie. I can talk all day long. Beth says I never know when to stop. Is Beth the one who stays at home and sometimes goes out with a little basket? Yes, that's Beth. The pretty one is Meg, and the curly-haired one is Amy, I believe. How did you find that out? Laurie answered frankly. When I'm alone up here, I can't help looking over at your house. You always seem to be having such good times. When the lamps are on, I see you all around the table with your mother. She looks so sweet. I haven't got any mother, you know. Grandpa lives among his books. Mr. Brooke, my tutor, doesn't stay here. I just stay at home alone. Why don't you visit us? Wouldn't your grandpa let you? I think he would, if your mother asked him. He's very kind, though he does not look so. Joe told him about their plays and plans, their hopes. Then they went on talking about books. Come down and see our books. Grandfather is out, so you needn't be afraid, said Laurie. I'm not afraid of anything, returned Joe. When they went to the library, Joe sighed. You must be the happiest boy in the world. You can't live only with books, said Laurie, shaking his head. Suddenly a bell rang, and Joe flew up, exclaiming with alarm, It's your grandpa! Well, what if it is? You aren't afraid of anything, you know, said the boy. I think I am a little bit afraid of him, but I don't know why I should be, said Joe. The doctor came to see you, sir, the maid beckoned as she spoke. Laurie went away, and his guest amused herself in her own way. She was standing before a fine portrait of Laurie's grandfather when the door opened again, and without turning, she said, I won't be afraid of him, for he's got kind eyes. I like him. Thank you, said a voice behind her, and there stood old Mr. Laurence. Poor Joe blushed, and her heart began to beat fast as she thought what she had said. The old gentleman said, So you're not afraid of me? Not much, sir. The old gentleman gave a short laugh, shook hands with her, saying, You've got your grandfather's character. He was a fine man, brave and honest. I was proud to be his friend. Thank you, sir. And Joe was quite comfortable after that. What have you been doing with my grandson? Asked the old gentleman. Only trying to be neighborly, sir. He seems a little bit lonely. I shall come and see your mother some fine day. There's the tea bell. Come, let's have tea. After tea, they found Mr. Laurence standing before the fire. There was a piano in the room. Joe asked Laurie to play the piano with a respectful expression. So Laurie played, and Joe listened. But the old man looked as if he didn't like Laurie to play. His music isn't bad, but I hope he will do as well in more important things, said Mr. Laurence, and added, "I hope you'll come again. My respects to your mother. Good night, Joe." He shook hands kindly. At home, Joe told everything to her family, and then asked, "Mother, why didn't Mr. Laurence like to have Laurie play?" "I'm not sure, but I think it was because his son, Laurie's father, married an Italian lady, a musician, which displeased the old man. The lady was good and lovely, but he didn't like her, and never saw his son after he married. They both died when Laurie was a little child, and then his grandfather took him home. The boy, who was born in Italy, is not very strong, and the old man is afraid of losing him, which makes him so careful." "Laurie's a nice boy. Can he come to see us, Mother?" "Yes, Joe, your little friend is welcome," said the mother. Chapter 5. A Great Surprise for Beth. Soon the girls and Laurie became very close friends, except Beth, for she was a shy girl. Everyone liked Laurie, and he informed his tutor that the Marches were brilliant girls. Never having known mothers or sisters, Laurie was so much impressed by them, and their busy lives made him ashamed of the lazy life he led. They were having very good times together. But Beth, though she wanted to play the grand piano, she did not have the courage to go to the big house. One day Mr. Laurence visited Mrs. March and said, "Laurie doesn't play the piano much. I'm glad of it, for he was getting too fond of it. But someone must play the piano to keep it in tune. Wouldn't some of your girls like to practice the piano?" Before Mrs. March could reply, Mr. Laurence went on, "They needn't speak or see anyone, but run in at any time. I study at the other end of the house. Laurie is out, and the servants are never near the drawing-room after 9 o'clock. Nobody will disturb them." When he rose to go, he said, "Please, tell the young ladies what I say, and if they don't want to come, never mind." Beth looked at him with gratitude, as she said sincerely, "Oh, sir, I want to come very, very much." "Are you the musical girl?" he asked. "I'm Beth. I love it dearly, and I'll come," she replied. "How kind you are, sir!" Beth blushed like a rose. The next day, having seen the old and young gentlemen out of the house, Beth went to the big house to play the piano. Beth at last touched the great instrument and forgot her fear and everything else. After that, she went to the house nearly every day, but she never knew that Mr. Laurence opened his study door to listen to her, and never saw Laurie standing in the hall to keep the servants away. She never suspected that the exercise books and new songs were put there especially for her. A few weeks after Beth asked, "Mother, I'm going to make Mr. Laurence a pair of slippers. He is so kind to me, I must thank him, and I don't know any other way. Can I do it?" "Yes, dear, it will please him very much, and be a nice way of thanking him. The girls will help you," replied Mrs. March. After many serious discussions with Meg and Joe, the pattern was chosen, the materials bought, and the slippers begun. Beth worked early and late. After several days of sewing, the slippers were ready. She wrote a short, simple note, and with Laurie's help, put them onto the study table, one morning before the old gentleman was up. The next day, while she was entering home, she heard her sisters' joyful voices. "Here's a letter from the old gentleman. Come quick and read it." At the door, her sisters ceased all pointing and all saying at once, "Look there! Look there!" Beth looked and saw the big surprise. There stood a little cabinet piano, with a letter to Miss Elizabeth March. "For me?" whispered Beth. holding on to Joe and feeling as if she should tumble down. "Yes, all for you. Don't you think he's the dearest old man in the world? Here's the letter. We didn't open it, but we're dying to know what he says," cried Joe. "You read it. I can't. Oh, it's so lovely," said Beth. Joe opened the paper and began to read. "Dear Miss March, I have had many pairs of slippers in my life, but I never had any that suited me so well as yours. I like to pay my debts, so I know you will allow the old gentleman to send you something which once belonged to the little granddaughter he lost. With hearty thanks and best wishes, your grateful friend, James Laurence." "Try it, honey. Let's hear the sound of the piano," said Hannah, who always took a share in the family joys and sorrows. So Beth lovingly touched the beautiful black and white keys and pressed the bright pedals. "You'll have to go and thank him," said Joe. "Yes, I'll go now, before I get frightened thinking about it." And Beth walked down the garden, through the hedge, and in at the Laurences' door. The girls were amazed. They would have been more amazed if they had seen what Beth did afterward. She went and knocked at the study door before she gave herself time to think, and when a voice called out, "Come in," she did go in, right up to Mr. Laurence, with only a small quaver in her voice. "I came to thank you, sir, for—" But she didn't finish. He looked so friendly that she forgot her speech, and, only remembering that he had lost her little girl he loved, she put both arms round his neck and kissed him. The old gentleman was so much surprised, but he liked it. Beth talked to him as if she had known him all her life. When she went home, he walked with her to her own gate, shook hands cordially. Chapter 6. Joe Gets Her Lesson. "Girls, where are you going?" asked Amy, coming into their room one Saturday afternoon and finding them getting ready to go out. "Little girls shouldn't ask too many questions," replied Joe. Turning to Meg, Amy said, "Let me come with you. I haven't got anything to do." "No, because you aren't invited." "You're going somewhere with Laurie. I know. You're going to the theater. Please take me with you," she cried. "Let's take her," began Meg. "If she goes, I won't, and if I don't, Laurie won't like it. He invited only us." Amy was so angry with Joe that she shouted at her in a threatening way, "You'll be sorry for this, Joe March." They had a pleasant time at the theater. When they got home, they found Amy reading. She never lifted her eyes from the book or asked a single question. The next day, Meg, Beth, and Amy were sitting together when Joe burst into the room, looking excited. "Has anyone taken my book?" Meg and Beth said, "No," at once, and looked surprised. Amy said nothing. "Amy, you've got it." "No, I haven't." "You know where it is, then." "No, I don't." "That's a lie," cried Joe, taking her by the shoulders. "It isn't. I haven't got it." "You know something about it, and you'd better tell at once, or I'll make you." And Joe shook her. "Do what you like. You'll never see your silly old book again. I burned it up," cried Amy. "What? My little storybook I was so fond of and worked so hard to finish before Father got home? Have you really burned it?" said Joe, while her hands clutched Amy nervously. "Yes, I did. I told you I'd make you sorry, and I have," Joe began crying in anger. "I can never write it again, and I'll never forgive you as long as I live." Joe rushed out of the room. Mrs. March came home and soon heard the story. "How could you do that to Joe?" asked Mrs. March to Amy. "She wrote those stories all herself. She worked over them patiently, putting her whole heart into her work, hoping to make something good enough to print." Amy felt really sorry. When Joe appeared, Amy could only say, "Please forgive me, Joe. I'm very, very sorry." "I never shall forgive you," was Joe's answer. No one spoke of the great trouble, not even Mrs. March. When Joe was in that mood, words didn't mean anything. It was not a happy evening. They sewed as usual, while their mother read aloud. When singing time came, Beth could only play the piano. Joe stood dumb as a stone, and Amy broke down, so Meg and Mother sang alone. As Joe kissed her mother and said, "Good night," Mrs. March whispered gently, "My dear, don't go to bed with your anger. Forgive each other." Joe felt so deeply injured that she really couldn't quite forgive her yet. So she shook her head and said, "It was an awful thing. I can't forgive her." The next day, Joe went out for skating with Laurie. Amy looked out and said, "Joe promised I should go with her next time, for this is the last ice skate we shall have. But it's no use to ask her to take me." "You were very naughty, and it's hard for her to forgive you. But she might do it now," said Meg. "Go after them. Don't say anything till Joe is enjoying herself, and then just kiss her." "I'll try," said Amy. She ran after them, who were just disappearing over the hill. It was not far to the river, but both were ready before Amy reached them. Joe saw her coming and turned her back. Laurie did not see. "I'll go and see if it's all right before we begin to race," Amy heard Laurie say. Joe heard Amy putting her skates on, but she never turned and went slowly, zigzagging down the river. "Keep near the shore! It isn't safe in the middle!" shouted Laurie to Joe. Joe realized that Amy hadn't heard Laurie, but she thought, no matter whether she heard or not, let Amy take care of herself. Amy was striking out toward the smoother ice in the middle of the river. For a minute, Joe stood still with a strange feeling in her heart. She turned her round, just in time to see Amy throw up her hands and go crashing through the ice into the cold water. Amy's cry made Joe's heart stop with fear. She tried to call Laurie, but her voice was gone. She tried to rush forward, but her feet seemed to have no strength in them. And for a second, she could only stand motionless. Suddenly, Laurie rushed and cried out, "Bring a piece of wood! Quick! Quick!" Laurie, lying flat, held Amy up by his arm till Joe brought some wood. Then, together, they got the child out. "Now we must walk her home as fast as we can. Pile our things on her," cried Laurie, wrapping his coat round Amy. They got Amy home. When Amy was comfortably asleep in front of the fire, "Mother, are you sure she is safe?" whispered Joe. "Quite safe, dear. She isn't hurt, and won't even take cold, I think. You were so sensible in covering and getting her home quickly," replied her mother. "Laurie did it all. I only let her go. Mother, if she should die, it would be my fault. It's my anger. I try to be calm, but I can't. Oh, Mother, what shall I do? What shall I do?" cried poor Joe, in despair. "Watch and pray, dear. Never get tired of trying, and never think it is impossible to conquer your fault," said Mrs. March, kissing the wet cheek so tenderly that Joe cried even harder. "You don't know, you can't guess how bad it is. It seems as if I could do anything when I'm in a passion. I'm afraid I shall do something dreadful some day, and spoil my life, and make everyone hate me. Oh, Mother, help me, do help me." "I will, my child, I will. Joe, dear, we all have our temptations. You think your temper is the worst in the world, but mine used to be just like it." "Yours, Mother? You're never angry." I've been trying to cure it for 40 years. I am angry nearly every day of my life, Joe, but I have learned not to show it." Joe felt comforted at once by the sympathy and confidence given her. "How did you learn to keep still?" asked Joe. "My good mother used to help me, but I lost her when I was a little older than you are, and for years had to struggle on alone. I had a hard time, Joe. Then your father came, and I was so happy that I found it easy to be good. But when I had 4 little daughters round me, and we were poor, the old trouble began again. And think that I am not patient by nature." "Poor mother! What helped you then?" "Your father, Joe. He never loses patience, never doubts or complains, but always hopes, and works and waits so cheerfully that one is ashamed to do otherwise before him. He helped and comforted me, and showed me that I must try to practice all the virtues I would have my little girls possess, for I was their example. It was easier to try for your sakes than for my own." "Oh, Mother, if I'm ever half as good as you, I shall be satisfied," cried Joe. "I hope you will be a great deal better, dear. You have had a warning. Remember it, and try to overcome your temper before it brings you greater sorrow." Amy sighed in her sleep. Joe leaned over her sister. As if she heard, Amy opened her eyes and held out her arms, with a smile that went straight to Joe's heart. Neither said a word, but they hugged one another close, in spite of the blankets, and everything was forgiven and forgotten. Chapter 7. Meg and the Gossip. Annie Muffet didn't forget her promise, and so one April day Meg went to stay at the Muffets' house. The Muffets were very fashionable, and simple Meg was rather scared at first. As Meg saw Annie's pretty dresses, she wanted to be rich more than ever. Annie had many friends and knew how to entertain them. Her older sisters, Belle and Clara, were fine young ladies. Mr. Muffet was a fat, jolly old gentleman, and Mrs. Muffet was a fat, jolly old lady, and they were all kind to Meg. When the evening for the small party came, she found that her dress was very old when compared with the others. Meg saw the girls glance at it and then at one another, and her cheeks began to burn. No one said a word about it. They were kind to her, but in their kindness Meg saw only pity for her poverty. Then a servant brought in a box of roses. "They are for Miss March," the man said, "and here's a note." "What fun! Who are they from? Didn't know you had a lover," cried the girls. "The note is from Mother, and the flowers from Laurie," said Meg simply. "Oh, indeed," said Annie with a funny look. Feeling almost happy again with her mother's loving words and with the flowers that Laurie sent, Meg enjoyed the party very much. Annie made her sing, and someone said she had a remarkably fine voice. So altogether she had a very nice time, till she heard someone asking on the other side of the wall, "How old is the Laurence boy?" 16 or 17, replied another voice. "It would be great for one of those girls, wouldn't it? Sally says they are very intimate now, and the old man thinks they are wonderful." "Mrs. M. has made her plans, I think, and will play her cards well," said Mrs. Muffet. "She colored up when the flowers came, poor thing. She'd be so nice if she had some nice clothes. Do you think she'd be offended if we offered to lend her a dress for Thursday?" asked another voice. "She's proud, but I don't think she'd mind." The gossip made Meg very angry. When it was all over, and she was quiet in her bed, she could think till her head ached. Her innocent friendship with Laurie was spoiled by these silly gossips. Meg had a restless night and got up unhappy and half ashamed of herself for not speaking out frankly and setting everything right. Something in the manner of her friends struck Meg. They treated her with more respect. All this surprised and flattered her, though she did not understand it till Miss Bell looked up from her writing and said, "Dear, I've sent an invitation to your friend, Mr. Laurence, for Thursday. We should like to know." Meg colored. "You are very kind, but I'm afraid he won't come." "Why not, chérie?" asked Miss Bell. "He's too old." "My child, what do you mean? What's his age?" cried Miss Clara. "Nearly 70, I believe," answered Meg. "Of course we meant the young man," exclaimed Miss Bell, laughing. "There isn't any. Laurie is only a boy," and Meg laughed also. "About your age," Nan said. "Nearer my sister Jo's. I am 17 in August," returned Meg. "It's very nice of him to send you flowers, isn't it?" said Annie, looking wise about nothing. "Yes, he often does, to all of us, for their house is full, and we are so fond of them. My mother and old Mr. Laurence are friends, you know, so it's quite natural that we children should play together." And Meg hoped they would say no more. "What will you wear on Thursday?" asked Sally. "My old white one again, if I can mend it fit to be seen. It got sadly torn last night," said Meg, trying to speak quite easily, but feeling very uncomfortable. "Why don't you send home for another?" said Sally. "I haven't got any other." "Only that? How funny!" Sally didn't finish her speech, for Belle shook her head at her and said kindly, "There's no need of sending home, Daisy. I've got a sweet blue silk dress, which I've outgrown, and you shall wear it to please me. Won't you, dear?" "You are very kind, but I don't mind my old dress if you don't. It does well enough for a little girl like me," said Meg. "Now do let me please myself by dressing you up in style," said Belle. Meg couldn't refuse the offer so kindly made. On Thursday evening, Belle shut herself up with her maid, and between them they turned Meg into a fine lady. They curled her hair, they polished her neck and arms with some fragrant powder, and made her lips look redder. And she wore the blue dress, too. She was like a doll. That night several young ladies, who had taken no notice of her before, were very affectionate all of a sudden. Several young gentlemen, who had only stared at her at the other party, asked to be introduced. She was laughing at the jokes of a young gentleman when she suddenly stopped laughing and looked confused, for just opposite she saw Laurie. He was staring at her with disapproval. He bowed and smiled, yet something in his honest eyes made her blush and wish she had her old dress on. "I'm glad you came. I was afraid you wouldn't," she said. "Jo wanted me to come and tell her how you looked, so I did," answered Laurie, without turning his eyes upon her, though he half smiled at her maternal tone. "What will you tell her?" asked Meg. "I shall say I didn't know you, for you look so grown up and unlike yourself. I'm quite afraid of you." "The girls dressed me up for fun, and I rather like it. Don't you like me so?" asked Meg. "No, I don't. I don't like fuss and feathers." Meg walked away, saying, "You are the rudest boy I ever saw." She went and stood at a quiet window till someone touched her, and turning, she saw Laurie. As he said, "Please forgive me. Come and dance with me. Come, I'll be good. I don't like your clothes, but I do think you are just wonderful." Meg smiled and they began dancing. "Laurie, I want you to do me a favor," said Meg. "Please don't tell them at home about my dress tonight. They won't understand the joke. I will tell them myself all about it, and I want to tell Mother how silly I've been. So you'll not tell, will you?" "I promise I won't. Just say I looked pretty well and was having a good time." "I'll say the first with all my heart, but how about the other? You don't look as if you're having a good time." "Are you?" "No, not just now. I only wanted a little fun, but not this way, I think." "Here comes Ned Moffat. What does he want?" said Laurie. "I promised him to dance." "How boring," said Meg. Later, Laurie saw Meg drinking champagne with Ned and his friend Fisher. "You'll have a headache tomorrow if you drink much of that. Meg, your mother doesn't like it, you know," he whispered, leaning over her chair, as Ned turned to refill her glass. "I'm not Meg tonight. I'm a doll who does all sorts of crazy things. Tomorrow I shall put away my fuss and feathers and be desperately good again," she answered. Meg danced and flirted, as the other girls did. When she went to bed, she felt that she hadn't enjoyed herself as much as she expected. She was sick all the next day, and on Saturday she went home. "It seems pleasant to have a quiet place, and home is a nice place," said Meg, as she sat with her mother and Joe in the evening. "I'm glad to hear you say so, dear, for I was afraid home would seem poor to you after your visit," replied her mother. Meg had told her adventures and said over and over what a charming time she had had, but something still seemed to worry her. When the younger girls went to bed, she sat thoughtfully staring at the fire and said, "Mother, I want to tell you something." "I thought so. What is it, dear?" "Shall I go away?" asked Joe. "Of course not. Don't I always tell you everything? I was ashamed to speak of it before the younger children, but I want you to know all the dreadful things I did at the Muffets." "We are prepared," said Mrs. March, smiling but looking a bit nervous. "I told you they dressed me up, but I didn't tell you that they powdered and made me look like a doll. Laurie didn't like it." "Is that all?" asked Joe. "No. I drank champagne and tried to flirt and was altogether awful," said Meg, and added, "There's something more. It's very silly, but I want to tell it, because I hate to have people say and think such things about us and Laurie." Then she told the gossip she had heard at the Muffets, and as she spoke, Joe saw her mother fold her lips tightly. "Rubbish!" cried Joe. "Just wait till I see Annie Muffet. How ridiculous! The idea of having plans and being kind to Laurie because he's rich and may marry us. He will be so angry with them when I tell him what those silly things say about us." "If you tell Laurie, I'll never forgive you. She mustn't, Mother," said Meg, looking desperately. "No, never repeat that foolish gossip, and forget it as soon as you can," said Mrs. March. "Mother, do you have plans, as Mrs. Muffet said?" asked Meg in a shy manner. "Yes, my dear, I have, as all mothers do, but mine are different from Mrs. Muffet's. I will tell you some of them, for the time has come. Joe, you also listen to my plans. I want my daughters to be beautiful and good, to be admired, loved, and respected, to have a happy youth, to be well and wisely married, and to lead useful, pleasant lives. To be loved by a good man is the best and sweetest thing which can happen to a woman, and I sincerely hope my girls may know this beautiful experience. It is natural to think of it, Meg, right to hope and wait for it, and wise to prepare for it, so that when the happy time comes, you may feel ready for the duties and worthy of the joy. My dear girls, I don't want you to marry rich men just because they are rich. Money is a needful and precious thing when well used, but I never want you to think it is the first thing to strive for. I'd rather see you poor men's wives, if you are happy and beloved. One thing to remember, my girls. Father and I hope and trust that our daughters, whether married or single, will be the pride and comfort of our lives. We will, Mother, we will! Cried both with all their hearts. Chapter 8. Play or Work. The 1st of June! The King family is going on holiday to the seashore tomorrow, and I'm free for 3 months, cried Meg, coming home one warm day. Aunt March went for holiday too, said Jo joyfully. So what will you do all your holiday? Asked Amy. I shall stay in bed and do nothing, replied Meg. All winter I had to spend my days working for other people, so now I'm going to rest. I will read my books, said Jo. Amy returned to Beth and said, Let's play and rest all the time. You may try it for a week and see if you like it. I think by Saturday night you will find that all play and no work is as bad as all work and no play. Oh no, it will be wonderful, I'm sure, said Meg. Next morning, Meg did not appear till 10 o'clock. She had to have her breakfast alone. The room seemed lonely and untidy, for Jo had not filled the vases, Beth had not dusted, and Amy's books were around. Meg sat to rest, which meant to imagine what pretty summer dresses she would get with her salary. Jo spent the morning on the river with Laurie, and the afternoon reading. Beth began to tidy things in her closet but getting tired soon, she left it half done and went to her music. Amy went to the garden, hoping someone would see and ask who the young artist was. As no one appeared, she went to walk. It rained, so she came home all wet. At tea time, all agreed that it had been a delightful but unusually long day. Meg, who had gone shopping in the afternoon and had got a sweet blue dress, now decided that she didn't like the dress. Jo had a headache because of reading too much. Beth was worried about her closet. Amy regretted to walk because the rain had made her clothes so bad and she had nothing to wear for Katie Brown's party the next day. The days kept getting longer and longer. The weather was unusually variable, and so were tempers. No one said that she was enough of the experiment, but by Friday night all were glad that the week was nearly done. Hoping to give the last lesson, Mrs. March gave Hannah a holiday. When they got up on Saturday morning, there was no fire in the kitchen, no breakfast in the dining room, and no mother anywhere. What has happened? Cried Jo. Meg ran upstairs and soon came back again, looking a little ashamed. Mother isn't sick, only very tired, and she says she is going to stay quietly in her room all day and let us do the best we can. So we must take care of ourselves. That's easy enough, and I like the idea. I'm aching for something to do. That is, some new amusement, you know, added Jo quickly. They were happy to find something to do, but soon realized the truth of Hannah's saying, "Housekeeping ain't no joke." "What a dreadful day this has been," began Jo. "It has seemed shorter than usual, but so uncomfortable," said Meg. Then Mrs. March came and took her place among them. "Are you satisfied with your experiment, girls, or do you want another week of it?" she asked. "I don't," cried Jo decidedly. "Nor do I," echoed the others. You think, then, that it is better to have a few duties and live a little for others. Mother, did you go away and let everything be, just to see how we'd get on? Cried Meg, who had had suspicions all day. Yes, while Hannah and I did your work, you got on pretty well, but still you were not very happy. So I wanted to show you what happens when everyone thinks only of herself. Don't you feel it is pleasant to help one another and to have daily duties? We do, Mother, we do, cried the girls. Then let me advise you to take up your little burdens again, for though they seem heavy sometimes, they are good for us, and lighten as we learn to carry them, said Mrs. March. Chapter 9. The Picnic. Beth was postmistress, for she was mostly at home and she liked the daily task of unlocking the little door and distributing the mail. One July day she came in with her hands full and went about the house leaving letters and parcels. "Here's your posy, Mother. Laurie never forgets that," she said, putting the fresh flowers in the vase. "Miss Meg March, one letter and a glove," continued Beth, delivering them to her sister, who sat near her mother. "Why, I left a pair over there, and here is only one," said Meg, looking at the glove. "Did you drop the other in the garden?" "No, I'm sure I didn't, for there was only one in the office." "I hate to have odd gloves." "Never mind, the other may be found. My letter is only a translation of the German song I wanted. I think Mr. Brooke did it, for this isn't Laurie's writing." Mrs. March glanced at Meg, who was looking very pretty with the little curls blowing about her forehead, and very womanly, as she sat sewing at her little work-table. 2 letters for Dr. Joe, a book, and a funny old hat, which covered the whole post office and stuck outside, said Beth, laughing as she went into the study where Joe sat writing. "What a sly fellow Laurie is! I said I wished bigger hats were the fashion because I burn my face every hot day. He said, 'Why mind the fashion? Wear a big hat and be comfortable.' I said I would if I had one, and he has sent this to me to try it. I'll wear it for fun and show him I don't care for the fashion." Jo began reading her letters. One from her mother which made her cheeks glow and her eyes fill, for it said to her, "My dear, I write a little word to tell you with how much satisfaction I watch your efforts to control your temper. You say nothing about your trials, failures, or successes, and think, perhaps, that no one sees them, but I have seen them all, and heartily believe in the sincerity of your resolution, since it begins to bear fruit. Go on, dear, patiently and bravely, and always believe that no one sympathizes more tenderly with you than your loving—" "Mother," said Jo, "that does me good. That's worth millions of money. Oh, I do try. I'll keep trying, and not get tired, since I have you to help me." Then she read Laurie's letter. Laurie wrote, "Dear Jo, some English girls and boys are coming to see me tomorrow, and I want to have a jolly time. We will have lunch and croquet, have a fire, and all sorts of things. They are nice people and like such things. Brooke will go to keep up boys steady. I want you all to come. Yours ever, Laurie." Jo cried and Meg went to tell the news. "Of course we can go, Mother." "Do you know anything about the visitors, Jo?" asked Meg. "Only that there are 4 of them. Kate is older than you, Fred and Frank, twins, about my age, and a little girl, Grace, who is 9 or 10. Laurie knew them abroad and liked the boys, but he didn't admire Kate much. Jo asked Beth if she should come too. "If you won't let any boys talk to me," said Beth. "Not a boy?" "I like to please Laurie, and I'm not afraid of Mr. Brooke. He is so kind. but I don't want to play or sing or say anything. I'll work hard and not trouble anyone, and you'll take care of me, Joe, so I'll go." "That's my good girl. You do try to fight off your shyness, and I love you for it. Fighting with faults isn't easy." "And I got a note from Mr. Laurence asking me to come over and play to him tonight," added Beth, whose friendship with the old gentleman prospered finely. "Now let's do double duty today so that we can play tomorrow with free minds," said Joe. In the morning, Beth, who was ready first, kept reporting what went on next door. "There's Laurie, looking like a sailor, nice boy. He's a carriage full of people, a tall lady, a little girl, and 2 dreadful boys. One is lame, he's got a crutch. Laurie didn't tell us that. Be quick, girls, it's getting late. Why, there is Ned Muffet. Meg, isn't that the man who bowed to you one day when we were shopping?" "So it is. How queer that he should come. I thought he was at the mountains. There is Sally. I'm glad she got back in time. Oh, Joe, you're not going to wear that awful hat. It's too absurd," said Meg. "I just will. It's so shady, light, and big. It will make fun, and I don't mind anything if I'm comfortable." With that, Joe marched straight away, and the rest followed. A bright little band of sisters, all looking their best in summer suits, with happy faces. Laurie ran to meet and present them to his friends in the most cordial manner. Meg was grateful to see that Miss Kate, though 20, was dressed with a simplicity, and who was much flattered by Mr. Ned that he came especially to see her. Beth took an observation of the new boys and decided that the lame one was not dreadful, but gentle, and she would be kind to him. Amy found Grace a well-mannered, merry little person, and after staring dumbly at one another for a few minutes, they suddenly became very good friends. Tents, lunch, and croquet utensils having been sent on beforehand, the 2 boats pushed off together, leaving Mr. Laurence waving his hat on the shore. Laurie and Joe rowed one boat, Mr. Brooke and Ned the other. Meg, in the other boat, was face to face with the rowers. Mr. Brooke was a grave, silent young man, with handsome brown eyes and a pleasant voice. Meg liked his quiet manners and considered him a walking encyclopedia of useful knowledge. He never talked to her much, but he looked at her a good deal. Ned was not very wise, but very good-natured, and altogether an excellent person to carry on a picnic. It was not far to Longmeadow, but the tent was ready by the time they arrived. A pleasant green field with 3 wide-spreading oaks in the middle and a smooth strip of turf for croquet. "Welcome to Camp Laurence," said the young host, as they landed with exclamations of delight. "Brooke is a commander-in-chief. I am commissary general. The other fellows are staff officers. And you, ladies, are company. The tent is for your especial benefit, and that oak is your drawing room. This is the mess room, and the 3rd is the camp kitchen. Now, let's have a game before it gets hot, and then we'll see about dinner." Frank, Beth, Amy, and Grace sat down to watch the game played by the other 8. Mr. Brooke chose Meg, Kate, and Fred. Laurie took Sally, Joe, and Ned. The English played well, but the Americans played better. Fred gave a stroke. His ball stopped an inch on the wrong side. No one was very near, and running up to examine, he gave it a sly nudge with his toe, which put it just an inch on the right side. "You pushed it. I saw you. It's my turn now," said Joe sharply. "Upon my word, I didn't move it. It rolled a bit, perhaps, but that's allowed," said Fred. "We don't cheat in America, but you can if you choose," said Joe angrily. Yankees are a deal the most tricky, everybody knows. There you go, returned Fred. Laurie whispered to his friend. Good for you, Joe. He did cheat. I saw him. We can't tell him so, but he won't do it again. Take my word for it. Meg drew her aside. It was dreadfully provoking, but you kept your temper, and I'm so glad, Joe. Time for lunch, said Mr. Brooke, looking at his watch. Commissary General, will you make the fire and get water, while Miss March, Miss Sally, and I spread the table? Who can make good coffee? Joe can, said Meg, glad to recommend her sister. Joe announced that the coffee was ready, and everyone settled themselves to a hearty meal. Everything seemed fresh and funny. Miss Kate took out her sketch and began drawing, and Margaret watched her, while Mr. Brooke lay on the grass with a book, which he did not read. How beautifully you do it! I wish I could draw, said Meg, with admiration and regret in her voice. Why don't you learn? I should think you had taste and talent for it, replied Miss Kate. I haven't got time. Your mamma prefers other skills, I think. So did mine, but I proved her that I had talent by taking a few lessons privately, and then she was quite willing I should go on. Can't you do the same with your governess? I have none. I forgot young ladies in America go to school more than us. Papa says they are very fine schools, too. You go to a private one, I suppose? I don't go at all. I am a governess myself. Oh, really? Said Miss Kate, but she might as well have said, Dear me, how dreadful! For her tone implied it, and something in her face made Meg color, and wish she had not been so frank. Mr. Brooke looked up and said quickly, Young ladies in America love independence. They are admired and respected for supporting themselves. Oh, yes, of course it's very nice and proper in them to do so, said Miss Kate in a patronizing tone that hurt Meg's pride. Did the German song suit Miss March? Inquired Mr. Brooke, to change the subject. Oh, yes, it was very sweet, and I'm much obliged to whoever translated it for me. And Meg's face brightened as she spoke. Don't you read German? Asked Miss Kate with a look of surprise. Not very well. My father, who taught me, is away, and I don't get on very fast alone, for I have no one to correct my pronunciation. Try a little now. Here is Schiller's Mary Stuart, and a tutor who loves to teach. Mr. Brooke laid his book on her lap with an inviting smile. It's so hard I'm afraid to try, said Meg. I'll read a bit to encourage you. And Miss Kate read one of the most beautiful passages in a perfectly correct but perfectly expressionless manner. Mr. Brooke made no comment as she returned the book to Meg, who said innocently, I thought it was poetry. Some of it is. Try this passage. Meg read as if alone, giving a little touch of tragedy to the words. If she had seen the brown eyes then, she would have stopped short, but she never looked up, and the lesson was not spoiled for her. Very well indeed, said Mr. Brooke, as she paused, quite ignoring her many mistakes, and looking as if he did indeed love to teach. Miss Kate shut her sketchbook, saying, I must look after Grace. And she strolled away, saying to herself, I didn't come to chaperone a governess, though she is young and pretty. What odd people these Yankees are. I'm afraid Laurie will be quite spoiled among them. I forgot that English people rather turn up their noses at governesses and don't treat them as we do, said Meg. Tutors also have rather a hard time of it there, as I know to my sorrow. There's no place like America for us workers, Miss Margaret, said Mr. Brooke. I'm glad I live in it then. I don't like my work, but I get a good deal of satisfaction out of it all, so I won't complain. I only wished I liked teaching as you do, said Meg. I think you would if you had a student like Laurie, I shall be very sorry to lose him next year," said Mr. Brooke. "Going to college, I suppose?" Meg's lips asked the question, but her eyes added, "And what becomes of you?" "As soon as he is off, I shall turn soldier. I am needed." "I am glad of that!" exclaimed Meg. "I should think every young man would want to go, though it is hard for the mothers and sisters who stay at home," she added sorrowfully. "I have neither, and very few friends to care whether I live or die," said Mr. Brooke, rather bitterly. "Laurie and his grandfather would care a great deal, and we should all be very sorry to have any harm happen to you," said Meg heartily. "Thank you. That sounds pleasant," began Mr. Brooke, looking cheerful again. The little party separated with good nights and good-byes, for the Vaughans were going to Canada. As the four sisters went home through the garden, Miss Kate looked after them, saying, without the patronizing tone in her voice, "In spite of their demonstrative manners, American girls are very nice when one knows them." "I quite agree with you," said Mr. Brooke. Chapter 10. Secrets. It was a cold October day. Jo caught the bus to town. When she got off the bus, she walked for some time and then stopped at the front of a building. She went in and out of the building for several times. She, of course, did not see the young gentleman watching her strange attitude. Then Jo pulled her hat over her eyes and walked up the stairs. In 10 minutes she came running downstairs with a very red face. Then she saw the young gentleman. It was Laurie, and she was surprised. He did not want to mention why he was there, but just said, "It's a secret. If I tell you, you must tell me yours." "Well, I've left 2 stories to a newspaper man, and he's to give his answer next week," whispered Jo. "Hooray for Miss March, the famous American writer!" cried Laurie, throwing up his hat and catching it again. "Hush! I said nothing about it because I didn't want anyone else to be disappointed." "What's your secret?" she asked. "You remember Meg's glove she lost some time ago at a picnic? I know where it is." "Is that all?" said Jo, looking disappointed, as Laurie looked with a face full of mystery. Laurie bent and whispered in Jo's ear where the glove was. She stood and stared at him for a minute, looking both surprised and displeased. Then Jo asked sharply, "How do you know?" "Saw it." "Where?" "Pocket. Isn't that romantic?" "No, it's ridiculous." "I thought you'd be pleased." "At the idea of anybody coming to take Meg away? No, thank you." Jo began running down the hill. She felt better again. Someone passed by and then looked at Jo. It was Meg. "You've been running, Jo. When will you grow up?" "It's hard enough to see you grow up all of a sudden," said Jo to Meg. "Let me be a little girl as long as I can." Remembering Laurie's secret, Jo felt sadly that Margaret was getting to be a woman and the separation time was near. For a week or so, Jo was strange. She rushed to the door when the postman rang. She was rude to Mr. Brooke, Laurie's tutor, whenever they met. She would sit looking at Meg and suddenly jumping up to shake and then kiss her. On the second Saturday, Meg heard Laurie's and Jo's laughters while she was sitting inside. "What shall we do with that girl? She never will behave like a young lady," sighed Meg. "I hope she won't. She is so funny as she is," said Beth. In a few minutes Jo came in and began reading the newspaper. "Is it anything interesting?" asked Meg. "Nothing but a story," replied Jo. "You'd better read it aloud," said Meg. Jo began to read. The girls listened with interest. It was about a love story, a romantic one, and most of the characters died in the end. They all liked the story very much. Who wrote it? Asked Beth. I did, said Joe. You? Cried Meg, dropping her work. It's very good, said Amy critically. I knew it! I knew it! Oh, Joe, I'm so proud! And Beth ran to hug her sister. Meg wouldn't believe it till she saw the words. Miss Josephine March, printed in the paper. Tell us about it. When did it come? How much did you get for it? What will Father say? Won't Laurie laugh? Cried the family. Joe told them everything. When I went to the newspaper man, he said he liked my stories, but didn't pay beginners, only let them print in his paper. So I let him have the 2 stories, and today this was sent to me. I shall write more, and he's going to pay for the next one. I am so happy, for in time I may be able to support myself and help the girls. That evening, the Marches were all happy and proud of Joe. Chapter 11. A Telegram. It was a dull November afternoon. The girls were sitting in the room together. Laurie came in and asked the girls, "Won't some of you come for a drive? It's a dull day, but the air isn't bad, and I'm going to take Mr. Brooke home. So will you come with me?" "I am busy," said Meg, taking out her work-basket, for she had agreed with her mother that it was best, for her at least, not to drive too often with the young gentleman. "We 3 will be ready in a minute," cried Amy, running away to wash her hands. A sharp ring, and a minute after, Hannah came in with a letter. "Telegraph," she said. At the word telegraph, Mrs. March took it, read the 2 lines, and dropped back into her chair, as white as the little paper. Laurie hurried downstairs to get water, while Joe read aloud, in a frightened voice. "Mrs. March, your husband is very ill. Come at once. S. Hale, Blank Hospital, Washington." Mrs. March was herself again directly, read the message over, and stretched out her arms to her daughters, saying, in a tone they never forgot, "I shall go at once, but it may be too late. Oh, children, children, help me to bear it." Hannah got up quickly. "I won't waste time crying," she said, and began packing things. They tried to be calm. Mrs. March returned to Laurie and said, "Please send a telegram saying that I will come at once. I'll take the next train early in the morning." "What else can I do? The horses are ready. I can go anywhere, do anything," he said. "Please leave a note at Aunt March's. Joe, give me that pen and paper." Joe drew the table before her mother, knowing that money must be borrowed from Aunt March. Laurie went off to send the telegram. Amy and Meg helped their mother. Mrs. March said Beth to go and ask Mr. Laurence for a couple of bottles of wine. "I'm not too proud to beg for Father," she said. "He will have the best of everything." Mr. Laurence came hurrying back with Beth, bringing many things the kind old gentleman could think of. He wanted to go with Mrs. March, but she did not accept this offer, for the gentleman was very old. Later on, Mr. Brooke came in. "I'm very sorry to hear of this, Mrs. March," he said. "I don't want you to go alone. I would like to travel with you." Meg looked at Mr. Brooke and said, "How kind you all are! Mother will accept, I'm sure, and it will be good to know that she has someone to take care of her. Thank you very, very much." Everything was arranged by the time Laurie returned with the note and money from Aunt March. But Joe was still away. They began to get anxious. At last she came and gave her mother some money, saying, "That's from me to make Father comfortable and bring him home." "My dear, where did you get it? $25? "I only sold what was my own." As she spoke, Joe took off her hat. Her hair was cut short. "Your hair! Your beautiful hair! Oh, Joe, how could you? My dear girl, there was no need of this. She doesn't look like my Joe any more. But I love her for it." They all talked at once, for they were surprised of what Joe had done. No one wanted to go to bed. At 10 o'clock, Mrs. March finished her job and said, "Come, girls." Beth went to the piano and played the father's favorite song. In the morning, Mrs. March went with Mr. Brooke. The girls were upset. "I feel as if there had been an earthquake," said Joe. "It seems as if half of the house was gone," added Meg. Chapter 12. Hard Days. As time passed, the girls began to behave as in the old days. Meg and Joe went back to their jobs. Amy and Beth did the housework with Hannah. They did not forget their duties, but at least they lost their anxiety. One day Beth said, "Meg, we must visit the Hummels. You know Mother told us not to forget them, but I don't feel good today, so I can't." The girls didn't want to. Each had an excuse for it. Meg promised she would go the next day and said, "Amy will be in soon, and she can go and visit the Hummels." So Beth lay down on the sofa. The others returned to their work, and the Hummels were forgotten. An hour passed. Amy didn't come. Beth had a headache, but she quietly filled her basket with food for the poor children and went out. It was late when she came back. She shut herself into her mother's room. Half an hour after, Joe found little Beth looking sick. "What's the matter?" cried Joe, as Beth put out her hand, as if to warn her off. "Oh, Joe, Mrs. Hummel's baby died in my hands," said Beth. "My poor dear, I should have gone there," said Joe, taking her sister in her arms. "I held the baby till Mrs. Hummel came with the doctor. He said it was scarlet fever. He told me to go home, or I'd have the fever." "No, you won't!" cried Joe. "Don't be frightened. I guess I won't have it badly. I looked in Mother's book and saw that it begins with headache, sore throat. Don't let Amy come. She never had it," said Beth. Hannah came in a minute and took the lead at once. "Now I'll tell you what we'll do," said Hannah. "We will have Dr. Bangs just to take a look at you, dear. Then we'll send Amy to stay with Aunt March, and one of you girls can stay at home and amuse Beth for a day or two." "I shall, because it's my fault she's so sick," said Joe decidedly. "I'll go and tell Amy," said Meg. Amy protested that she would not go, but Laurie came and said to her, "If you go to Aunt March's, I'll come and take you out every day, driving or walking." The girls decided not to write their mother about Beth's illness. Dr. Bangs came and said that Beth had symptoms of the fever, but he thought she would have it lightly. Beth did have the fever. The girls knew nothing about illness, and Mr. Laurence was not allowed to see her. Dr. Bangs did his best, but left a good deal to the excellent nurse, Hannah. Jo devoted herself to Beth day and night. Meg wanted to write her mother the truth, but she was not allowed. Then a letter came saying that Mr. March was getting worse again. Beth was getting worse too. Jo was frightened. How dark the days seemed now. How sad and lonely the house. They were so happy once. Meg felt how rich she had been in things more precious than any luxuries money could buy. In love, protection, peace, and health. Amy longed to be at home. She wanted to work for Beth, feeling now that no work would be hard. Everyone missed Beth. The milkman, baker, grocer, and butcher, the neighbors. Poor Mrs. Hummel. Dr. Bangs came twice a day. Hannah sat up at night. Meg kept a telegram in her desk all ready to send off at any moment, and Jo never stirred from Beth's side. When Dr. Bangs came at the 1st of December, he looked at Beth, held her hot hand, and said to Hannah, If Mrs. March can leave her husband, she must come here." Jo ran to send the telegram to her mother. She was soon back, and Laurie, too, came in with a letter, saying that Mr. March was getting better again. Jo read the letter thankfully, but she looked so miserable that Laurie asked quickly, "What is it? Is Beth worse?" "I've sent a telegram to Mother," said Jo. "Oh, Jo, it's not so bad, is it?" cried Laurie. "Yes, it is. She doesn't know us. She doesn't look like my Beth, and there's nobody to help us bear it. Mother and Father have both gone, and God seems so far away I can't find Him." As the tears streamed fast down her cheeks, Jo stretched out her hand in a helpless sort of way. Laurie took it in his, whispering, "I'm here. Hold on to me, Jo." She could not speak, but the warm, friendly hand comforted her. Soon she dried the tears and looked up with a grateful face. "Thank you, Laurie. I'm better now. Keep hoping for the best. That will help you, Jo. And soon your mother will be here. I will tell you something which will make you very happy." "What is it?" cried Jo. "I telegraphed to your mother yesterday, and Brooke answered she'd come at once, and she'll be here tonight, and everything will be all right." Jo flew out of her chair and threw her arms round his neck. She did not weep again, but laughed and clung to her friend. Laurie was amazed. He smoothed her hair and followed this a few shy kisses. Jo put him gently away, saying breathlessly, "Oh, don't! I didn't mean to. It was dreadful of me, but I couldn't help flying at you." "I don't mind," laughed Laurie. A breath of fresh air seemed to blow through the house, and something better than sunshine brightened the quiet rooms. Everything appeared to feel the hopeful change. Beth's bird began to chirp again, and every time the girls met, they whispered one another, "Mother's coming, dear, Mother's coming." But Beth lay unconscious. All day she lay so. Night came at last, and every time the clock struck, the sisters, still sitting on either side of the bed, looked at each other with brightening eyes, for each hour brought help nearer. The doctor came in to say that some change, for better or worse, would probably take place about midnight, at which time he would return. The girls never forgot that night, for no sleep came to them as they kept their eyes on their watch. At 1 o'clock, Laurie left to take Mrs. March from the station. It was 2 when Jo, who stood at the window, heard a movement by the bed. A dreadful fear passed coldly over Jo, as she thought, "Beth is dead." The fever and the look of pain were gone, and the beloved little face looked so that Jo leaned over her sister and softly whispered, "Goodbye, my Beth, goodbye." Hannah woke up, hurried to the bed, looked at Beth, felt her hands, and sat down, saying, "The fever's turned, she's sleeping natural, and she breathes easy. Thank God." The doctor confirmed it when he came. "Yes, my dears, I think the little girl will be all right. Keep the house quiet, let her sleep." "If Mother would only come now," said Jo. There was a sound of bells at the door below, a cry from Hannah, and then Laurie's voice saying in a joyful whisper, "Girls, she's come, she's come." Chapter 13. Mr. Brooke. When Beth woke from her long, healing sleep, she saw her mother. She only smiled, then slept again. Then Meg and Jo listened to their mother, who told them about their father. Mr. Brooke was with their father now. He promised to take care of him. Laurie went and brought Amy from Aunt March's house. That evening, while Meg was writing to her father, Jo went upstairs into Beth's room. "I want to tell you something, Mother." "About Meg? How quickly you guessed! Last summer, Meg left a pair of gloves over at the Laurence's garden, and only one was returned. We forgot about it, till Laurie told me that Mr. Brooke kept it, for he liked Meg, but couldn't say anything to Meg, for she was so young, and he himself so poor." "Do you think Meg cares for John?" asked Mrs. March. "Who?" cried Joe. "Mr. Brooke. I call him John, because we have been close friends at the hospital. He has been good to father, and if Meg wants, we would like them to get married. He was perfectly honorable about Meg, for he told us he loved her, but he wants to earn more money for a comfortable home." Joe leaned her chin on her knees. She seemed sad. "Joe, it is natural that you will all go to homes of your own in time," said Mrs. March. "But I do want to keep my girls as long as I can, and I am sorry that this happened so soon, for Meg is only 17, and it will be some years before John can make a home for her. Your father and I have agreed that she will not be married before 20. If she and John love one another, they can wait and test their love by doing so." "I understand, Mother, and agree, but I'm disappointed about Meg, for I'd planned to have her marry Laurie and live in luxury. Wouldn't it be nice?" asked Joe. "Laurie is younger than Meg, you know," began Mrs. March. "Don't make plans, Joe, but let time and their own hearts do." Meg came in and showed her letter to Mrs. March. "Beautifully written," said Mrs. March. "Please add that I send my love to John." She glanced over the letter and gave it back. "Do you call him John?" asked Meg, smiling. "Yes, he has been like a son to us, and we are very fond of him," replied Mrs. March. "I'm glad of that. He is so lonely. Good night, Mother. It's so comfortable to have you here," was Meg's answer. The kiss her mother gave her was a very tender one, and as she went away, Mrs. March said, "She doesn't love John yet, but will soon learn to." Chapter 14. Things Getting Better. It was like sunshine after a storm. The days were much more peaceful. Weeks followed. Mr. March wrote about coming home soon. Beth was able to lie on the study sofa all day, amusing herself with the cats. It was Christmas Day. "I'm so full of happiness that if Father was only here," said Beth. "So am I," added Joe. "I'm sure I am," echoed Amy. "Of course I am," cried Meg. "How can I be otherwise?" said Mrs. March gratefully, as her eyes went from her husband's letter to Beth's smiling face. Laurie opened the door and said, "Here's a Christmas present for the March family." He moved away, and a tall man holding the arm of another tall man appeared at the door. It was Mr. March, and the other man helping him was Mr. Brooke. Mr. March became invisible under lots of loving arms. Mrs. March was the first to recover herself, and held up her hand with a warning, "Hush! Remember Beth." But it was too late. The study door flew open. Beth ran straight into her father's arms. Mrs. March began to thank Mr. Brooke for taking care of her husband. Mr. March told how he had longed to surprise them, and how, when the fine weather came, he had been allowed by his doctor to take advantage of it. How Brooke was a perfect young man. There never was such a Christmas dinner as they had that day. Hannah brought the fat turkey. Mr. Laurence and his grandson dined with them. Also Mr. Brooke, at whom Joe glowered darkly. 2 easy chairs stood side by side at the head of the table, in which sat Beth and her father. They drank, told stories, sang songs, and had a good time. When the guests departed, the happy family sat together round the fire. "Just a year ago we were complaining about the Christmas we expected to have. Do you remember?" asked Joe, breaking a short pause which had followed a long conversation about many things. "It has been quite a pleasant year," said Meg. I think it's been a pretty hard one, observed Amy. I'm glad it's over because we've got you back, whispered Beth, who sat on her father's knee. Rather a rough road for you to travel, my little girl. But you have got on bravely, and I've discovered some new things about you, said Mr. March, looking with fatherly satisfaction at the 4 young faces. Oh, tell us what they are, cried Meg, who sat beside him. Here is one, said Mr. March, taking up Meg's hand, which lay on the arm of his chair. He pointed to her fingers, a burn on the back, and 2 or 3 little hard spots on the palm. I remember a time when this hand was white and smooth, and your first care was to keep it so. It was very pretty then, but to me it is much prettier now. This hardened palm has earned something, and I'm sure the sewing done by these pricked fingers will last a long time. Meg, my dear, the womanly skill keeps home happy more than white hands. I'm proud to shake this little hand, ended Mr. March. What about Jo? Please say something nice, for she has tried so hard and been so very, very good to me, said Beth in her father's ear. He laughed and looked across at the tall girl who sat opposite, with an unusually mild expression in her face. Her hair may be short, said Mr. March, but I see a young lady. Her face is rather thin and pale just now, because of sorrow and anxiety. But I like to look at her, for she has grown gentler, and her voice is lower. She moves quietly, and takes care of a little person in a motherly way. I have a strong, helpful, tender-hearted girl now. Now, Beth, said Amy, longing for her turn, but ready to wait. She is not so shy as she used to be, began their father cheerfully. But recollecting how nearly he had lost her, he held her close, saying tenderly, with her cheek against his own, I've got you safe, my Beth, and I'll keep you so, thank God. After a minute's silence, he looked down at Amy and said, I observed that Amy helped everybody. She gave Meg her place tonight, and has waited for everyone with patience and good humor. I conclude that she has learned to think of other people more and of herself less, and has decided to try and change her character carefully. Beth said, It's singing time now, and I want to be in my old place. I'll try to sing the song. This music is for Father. So, sitting at the little piano, Beth softly touched the keys and began singing. Chapter 15. Aunt March Solves the Problem. In the afternoon, Meg and Jo were sitting at the window. Laurie was out in the garden. When he saw Meg at the window, he fell down on one knee in the snow, in a melodramatic way, beat his breast, tore his hair, and put out his arms towards her as if begging. And when Meg told him to behave himself and go away, he pretended to cry and stay in despair. What is he trying to do? Asked Meg, laughing. He's showing you how your John will act. Touching, isn't it? Answered Jo. Don't say my John. It isn't proper or true. But Meg repeated these words silently, as they sounded pleasant to her. Then she said, Please, Jo, I've told you I don't care much about him, and there isn't anything to be said. But we are all to be friendly and go on as before. We can't, I see it, and so does Mother. You aren't like you were before, and seem ever so far away from me. I don't mean to blame you, but I wish it was all settled. I hate to wait, so if you mean ever to do it quickly, said Jo. I can't say anything till he speaks, and he won't, because Father said I was too young, began Meg, bending over her work with a queer little smile. The smile showed that she did not quite agree with her father on that point. If he asks you to marry him, you will cry or be ashamed, but I am sure you won't say no to him. I'm not so silly and weak as you think. I know just what I should say, for I've planned it all." "Would you mind telling me what you'd say?" asked Joe more respectfully. "I should say, quite calmly, 'Thank you, Mr. Brooke. You are very kind, but I agree with Father that I am too young to marry, so please say no more, but let us be friends as we were.'" "Humph! That's cool enough. I don't believe you'll ever say it." "I will tell him I've made up my mind, and shall walk out of the room with dignity." Meg rose as she spoke, but ran back to her seat when she heard a knock at the door. Joe opened the door angrily. "Good afternoon. I came to get my umbrella, and I wanted to see how your father feels today," said Mr. Brooke. "He's very well. I'll tell them that you are here." Joe went out of the room to give Meg a chance to make her speech, but the moment she vanished, Meg began murmuring. "Mother will like to see you. Sit down, please. I'll call her." "Don't go. Are you afraid of me, Margaret?" said Mr. Brooke. Meg blushed up, for he had never called her Margaret before, and she was surprised to find how natural and sweet it seemed to hear him say it. "How can I be afraid when you have been so kind to Father? I wish I could thank you for it." "Shall I tell you how?" asked Mr. Brooke, holding the small hand fast in his hands and looking at Meg with so much love. "Oh, no, please don't," she said, trying to withdraw her hand. "I won't trouble you. I only want to know if you love me a little, Meg. I love you so much," added Mr. Brooke tenderly. This was the moment for the calm, proper speech, but Meg didn't make it. She forgot every word of it and answered, "I don't know," so softly. He smiled, pressed her hand gratefully, and said, "Will you try and find out? I want to know so much." "I'm too young," said Meg, hesitating, yet rather enjoying it. "I'll wait, and in the meantime, you could be learning to like me. Would it be a very hard lesson?" "Not if I choose to learn it, but—" "Please choose to learn, Meg. I love to teach," broke in John, getting possession of the other hand, so that she had no way of hiding her face as he bent to look into it. Meg saw that he was smiling. He was so sure of his success. That made Meg a little annoyed. Withdrawing her hands, she said, "I don't choose. Please go away." "Do you really mean that?" he asked anxiously. "Yes, I do. I don't want to be worried about such things. Father says I needn't. It's too early." "I hope you'll change your mind. I'll wait and say nothing till you have more time." "Don't think of me at all," said Meg. Suddenly, Aunt March came in. The old lady wanted to see her nephew. She came in quietly to surprise the family, but she surprised two of them so much that Meg was as if she had seen a ghost, and Mr. Brooke vanished into the study room. "What's all this?" cried the old lady. "It's Father's friend. I'm so surprised to see you," said Meg. "I can see that," returned Aunt March, sitting down. "What is Father's friend saying to you?" "Mr. Brooke came to take his umbrella," began Meg. "Brooke? That boy's tutor? Ah, I understand now. I know all about him. I made Joe tell me." "You haven't accepted to marry him, have you?" cried Aunt March. "If you do, not 1 penny of my money ever goes to you. Remember that, and be a sensible girl." "I shall marry whom I please, Aunt March, and you can leave your money to anyone you like," she said, nodding her head. "Is that the way you take my advice? You'll be sorry for it. Now, Meg, be reasonable and take my advice. You must marry a rich person." "Father and Mother don't think so. They like John, though he is poor. John is good and wise. He's talented. He's willing to work. He's so brave. Everyone likes and respects him, and I'm proud to think he cares for me, though I'm so poor and young and silly," said Meg. He knows I have money, so he wants to marry you to get my money, child. That's why he likes you." "Aunt March, how dare you say such a thing? I won't listen to you a minute if you talk so," cried Meg. "My John wouldn't marry for money. We are willing to work, and we mean to wait. I'm not afraid of being poor, for I've been happy so far, and I know I will be with him because he loves me, and I—" Meg stopped there, remembering all of a sudden that she had told her John to go away. Aunt March was very angry. "Well, you've lost more than you know. Don't expect anything from me when you are married. Your Mr. Brooke's friends must take care of you." And slamming the door in Meg's face, Aunt March drove off. Meg stood for a moment, undecided whether to laugh or cry. Before she could make up her mind, Mr. Brooke came back in from the next room and said, "I heard everything, Meg. Thank you for defending me, and Aunt March for proving that you do love me a little bit." "I didn't know how much till she said those things about you," began Meg. "So may I stay and be happy? May I, dear?" "Yes, John," said Meg, hiding her face on Mr. Brooke's waistcoat. Joe came softly downstairs and saw them like that. John laughed and said, "Sister Joe, congratulate us." Rushing upstairs to her room, Joe cried and told the awful news to Beth and Amy. The little girls, however, considered it a most agreeable and interesting event. At supper, no one ate much, but everyone looked very happy. After supper, Laurie came in with flowers for Mrs. John Brooke. When he saw Joe's face, he asked, "What's the matter? You don't look happy." "I don't want this marriage, but I will not say a word against it," said Joe. "You can't know how hard it is for me to give up Meg," she continued. "You don't give her up," said Laurie. "It can never be the same again. I've lost my dearest friend," sighed Joe. "You've got me anyhow. I'm not good for much, I know, but I'll stand by you, Joe, all the days of my life." "I know you will," returned Joe, gratefully shaking hands. "Well, now, it's all right, you see. Meg is happy, Brooke will settle everything, Grandpa will help him, and it will be very jolly to see Meg in her own little house. It will take 3 years to come back from college, and then we'll go abroad on some nice trip or other. Wouldn't that make you happy?" "I rather think it would, but we don't know what may happen in 3 years," said Joe thoughtfully. "That's true. Don't you wish you could take a look forward and see where we will all be then?" "I do," replied Laurie. "I think not, for I might see something sad, and everyone looks so happy now." And Joe's eyes went slowly round the room, brightening as they looked, for the prospect was a pleasant one. Father and Mother sat together. Amy was drawing a picture of Meg and John. Beth lay on her sofa, talking cheerily with her old friend, Mr. Laurence. And Joe sat in her favorite chair and smiled at Laurie.